pleasure to say that this is one of the worst pieces of legislation that has been before this Dáil, and our amendments deal with the removal of presumptive minimum sentences for repeat sexual offenders, because the measures being put forward here don't act as a deterrent and won't in any way have an impact on reoffending. And the Minister himself and everybody from the department has admitted that in the discussions at the other stages of this process, when the best she could wrestle with is to come up and say that by putting forward this bill you're recognising the impact of sexual offences on the individual and on society, and you're ensuring that appropriate measures are available to the judiciary at sentencing in order to ensure that the crimes can be dealt with appropriately and effectively. Well, guess what? The key thing here is that the judiciary already have measures available to them at sentencing in order to ensure that that's the case. The bill won't change that. The bill doesn't give them any new or stronger powers. If and when, presumably, this bill passes, the judiciary will have exactly the same sentencing powers that they do now, and exactly the same discretion that they have. Nothing, absolutely nothing, will change in that regard. And before I go further in terms of deal with this amendment, I have to preface it by saying it goes without saying that of course I agree that sexual crimes are some of the very worst crimes in our society, and their awfulness is compounded by the situation that it has taken place against decades of relative impunity towards sexual offenders, whether because the perpetrators were priests or because of the state's attitude to women or whatever. So I obviously, of course, understand the desire to make sure that sanctions for such offences are as serious as they should be. Of course, but this doesn't do that. The prevention of sexual offences, let alone repeat sexual offences, isn't something that can be dealt with lightly by a simple thing of longer prison sentences, and it's certainly too complicated to be handled by the idea of mandatory or presumptive minimum sentencing. Of course, I wholeheartedly agree that we have a massive problem with sexual violence and how our criminal justice treats them, sentencing and all of the rest of it. But this bill isn't going to address any of that, not any of it. It's not going to deter sexual offenders. And what it is, and I'm not saying it lightly, this is the worst type of politics that this Dáil has been responsible for, that this government has done nothing about the real issues in terms of sexual violence, comes up with this bill, which you admit yourself isn't going to do anything, but sort of contributes to maybe a feel-good that we're actually doing something about this terrifically horrible problem. But it flies in the face of evidence-based policy and evidence-based legislation. For years, organisations like the Law Reform Commission, the IPRT and so on have given us evidence which have shown that presumptive or mandatory minimum sentences for any crime are not an effective deterrent. While it might feel like they are, the evidence says that they are not, and they particularly are not a deterrent in relation to cases of sexual violence, whereas Deputy Wallace says the evidence of repeat offending, and that's all that this bill deals with, the evidence there is that it has even lesser impact in terms of that. Between 2011 and 2013, the Law Reform Commission expended 457 pages across a consultation paper and a report on mandatory sentencing. At the end of it, recommended that existing presumptive sentencing regimes should be repealed and no new ones should be introduced. And here we are. In 2014, the Strategic Review of Penal Policy also made clear recommendations that no new presumptive sentencing schemes should be introduced. The Strategic Review of Penal Policy comprised a membership that included the Department of Justice, the Gardaí, the IPRT, victims, probation services, not exactly fringe politics. People at the coalface of dealing with these issues said, don't won't implement any more presumptive minimum sentencing. And what are you doing? You're bringing in exactly that when you admitted yourself at committee that it's going to have no impact whatsoever, because, as Deputy Wallace said, even if the court is satisfied that it's disproportionate, the judges can do what they like anyway. So while you're ignoring that, in the meanwhile we have a bill floundering in the Shannon about a judicial or council bill which could actually deal with those one or two individuals in our judiciary who have shown themselves to be not up to the task that they've been charged with. That sits there languishing, and we know from the coroner's bill how difficult it is to see legislation through here. And we're dealing with this piece of nonsense that's not going to have any impact when that bill we could have used the resources for that. It's absolutely the worst type of politics. Now, we know that Sinn Féin obviously cut a deal with the government in relation to the Judicial Appointments Bill, sadly, in return, however, for having proper sentencing guidelines. Again, proper sentencing guidelines is something that the judiciary could do with, is something that we could be dealing with here, but no, we're not, because we're playing a game here to keep this government on the road as an absolute sop. I think it's an absolute disgrace because, you know, apart from that general point, let's look at the actual text. And any deputy who votes for this and doesn't support our amendment hasn't obviously read the text, because, you know, what we have is an eye-wateringly complicated formula for calculating minimum sentences and who they should apply to. It's absolutely arbitrary, because what's been said here is that if someone commits a sexual offence that carries a sentence of 5 years and then goes on to commit another sexual offence within 10 years of conviction, then a presumptive minimum applies. So what if the offender rapes somebody 10 years and 5 days after the first offence? What signal, if this is just a signal, what are we sending to that, to the victim of that the violent assault on her is less serious if it hadn't happened 5 days before that? It's absolutely ridiculous. You couldn't answer any of the points for how you even came up with that mad logic there. I think it's reprehensible, and I think it's the blunt instrument of legislation can't deal with the nuances. The irony here is that Deputy O'Callaghan in committee lashed this out of it, in the sense of his analysis of how rubbish this bill was very, very well articulated. But then, of course, confidence in supply, sure, we'll go along with anyway. And as long as we continue this type of nonsense in Ireland, we'll go nowhere, and we won't be serving any victims any justice whatsoever. Thanks, Ceann Comhairle. I have to say I find this discussion utterly demoralising and one of the worst reflections of this House, because we have a massive problem in our society in terms of how we deal with sexual crime in our criminal justice system, from inconsistent sentencing to traumatising victims by putting them on trial, by the trial through the court process, our pathetic conviction rates for sexual crimes, not to mention the broader cultural issues around consent and all of that. And nothing in this bill addresses any of this thing. And I'm sorry, Minister Doherty, but it's not a first step at all. It's not going to achieve it, even if we're generous and ignore the convoluted formula that applies in this bill and ignore that meat. If we're generous and say, well, it's about sending a signal. What signal are we sending by this? When the suspended sentences, maybe in instances which are the worst part of the initial sentence, when the suspended portion is discounted for the calculation of the formula, well, then the message that you're signaling is, well, sure, look, if you got away with it the first time, lads, you're not going to come under this formula second time around. So it's an appalling message to be sent. The message that's been sent here is that nothing is changing, that legislation in this House is going to be done in a reactive, knee-jerk, emotional, tabloid-led way, not evidence-led way. And that's really scary, because we commission hours of research into the Law Reform Commission, sentencing guidelines and so on. We're given an answer from the experts in those fields, including representatives of victims' groups, who tell us don't go down the road of any more presumptive minimum sentencing, because it doesn't work, the evidence doesn't support it, and here we are doing it. If the signal is to be so disrespectful to the victims of sexual crime by pretending to be doing something that will address their concerns. Well, I don't want to be part of that pretence.
Right,